So welcome to our February colloquium on responsibility in times of resources scarcity with Professor Dr. Michael Hess. Professor Hess studied physics at the University of Regensburg, where he was awarded a doctorate for his work in the field of biophysics, and he spent the first part of his career at Fogra doing industrial research. In 1998, he received his habilitation from the University of Grenoble, where he has since taught as a distinguished professor in the areas of business strategy and sustainability, with a focus on knowledge transfer and research in the areas of sustainability, decarbonization, and eco-design. Since last year, he's also a partner on the consulting group Monopterus, with a focus on technology, CSR, environmental footprint, and product strategy. Today, he will speak on the responsibility in times of resources scarcity against the backdrop of shrinking resources, questions of responsibility for the consumption of resources, measures, legal regulations, time frame, and boundaries of responsibility. Thank you, Professor Hess, for joining us, and the room is yours now.
Thank you, Pauline, and thanks for the invitation in general. I hope that we can go along without networks problems, because I did not hear part of the introduction Pauline gave. So of course, I assumed that everything was into my favor. What I would like to discuss today with you is a very wide set of questions dealing with responsibility in terms of raw material scarcity. So the idea is to ask ourselves, if we as a society have less and less materials available, which is predictable, then how could we deal with responsibility? How long would responsibility eventually last? And it's just the idea to scratch on the surface of a certain question, because doing this at an exhaustive level will not work in this shorter time. So what we will focus on are essentially the words that we contained in the title. It's responsibility, declining resources, or rather availability of resources, and certain aspects involve time. And as I said, I don't intend to deliver a hierarchy of rationales or an exhausting discussion, as that would take significantly longer than the time available we have today. Now, the first thing I'd like to deal with is what are legal aspects around the term responsibility. We'll then deal with declining availability of resources and with time. Now, responsibility, if you browse literature, is both an ethical and a legal concept. And I'm not going to touch on the ethical aspect of responsibility. The legal aspect, and with this, I'd like to indicate something. These small letters down here indicates where I found it important to share sources for slides. So this was taken out, this quote here was taken out of this source. Back. So the legal responsibility is regarded as the duty to take a stand for an action and its consequences. And there is an immanent notion to that, and it's a prerequisite that says, at the moment of something being done for which responsibility needs to be taken, there must be a transgression of defined legal norms. To repeat, I assume that some of you may not be fluent in legal terms, so the message here is, in German, wenn man Verantwortung übernehmen muss, muss es zu dem Zeitpunkt, an dem eine Verantwortungsübertretung stattgefunden hat, eine Rechtsnorm gegeben hat, die man übertreten hat. Eine Verantwortung kann nicht genommen werden für irgendwas, wo erst danach die Verantwortung oder eine Rechtsnorm bekannt war. So, the prerequisite means that responsibility cannot be requested in a case in which the legal norm only came into existence after the actual doing took place. Interestingly enough, there is also in our legal system a temporal component to responsibility. So the pursuit of responsibility ends with a statute of limitations. And that does not mean acquittal. That does not mean that you are not guilty, provided you did something, but rather it's an exemption of punishment, because the lawmaker says after a certain amount of time, it's almost impossible to reconstruct the boundary conditions for what you want to be or for what they want to be holding someone responsible for. Again in German, Verantwortung endet rechtlich mit dem Ende der Verjährung. Es gibt Verjährungsfristen. Eine Verjährung heißt nicht, dass man nach der Verjährung unschuldig ist. Sie heißt nur, dass man nach der Verjährung nicht mehr bestraft werden kann, weil der Gesetzgeber sagt, naja, ich kann nach einer Zeit, die so lang ist wie die Verjährung, nicht mehr rekonstruieren, was zum Zeitpunkt der Tat eigentlich passierte. Und deswegen ist die Wahrscheinlichkeit, dass man falsch urteilt, sehr hoch. So I'm trying to stick with English from now on. The responsibility also, of course, relates to resources. And the context is rather simple. If natural resources are becoming scarcer and more difficult to access and to harvest, then life simply goes along with consumption of material and energy. And if I consume something now, apparently it's not going to be available for future generations afterwards, provided I consume more than, with respect to energy, than what the sun and the earth may deliver anyways. So if we start with the fact that world is transparent and has a limited amount of resources to deliver, responsibility for material availability is implicit to all consumption. If you do not have an indefinitely large world, apparently consumption will limit resources for future generations. Now, this type of thinking has already been part of the very early definitions of sustainability. In the German context, generally, a German forester, Johann von Carlowitz, has been quoted as the first person to, in a book that he wrote, talk about sustainability. Now, it's interesting to note that from a historical perspective, von Carlowitz lived in the Göttingen area, and he's been traveling prior to writing his book throughout Europe. He especially has been in England, in France, and in Italy, where ideas very close to what we think sustainability is today has already been experimented with and worked with prior to von Carlowitz's publication. However, in the German language area, the area in those countries Germany is spoken at, von Carlowitz is regarded as one of the first to speak about sustainability. Now, his definition, the crucial two sections of his book were, and I'm reading it, it is the greatest art, science, and care and establishment of local lands, so that the lands will rest on how to establish such conservation and cultivation that the timber will be able for a continuous, sustainable, and permanent use. So the mindset as we know it, essentially out of the financial world, you live off the interest rate. You do not live off capital. An interesting and often not quoted sentence in his book is the second one. It says that One should not throw away old clothes until one has new ones. And the like, one should not drive away the supply of mature wood until one sees that against the sufficient regrowth. So if you are acquainted with the ideas of cyclic value chains, circular economies, then you see almost all components of those circular economies already in his definitions. The only one that is missing is product design, because he assumes product design as being self-explaining. But the rest you already see. It's production, it's waste or reuse, and it's the extension of lifetime as we discussed it today. So it's remarkable that all of these concepts exist rather long already. And just as a side note, as we came from legal discussions, even in the 1300s, there had been a law in London that prevented locksmiths to use coal-driven fires because of the fog would concentrate the coal dust and lead to coffin in the passerbys. So legal laws or laws around sustainability or around preventing harm to people by that have already been existing for a very long time, several hundred years. Now, responsibility, as I said, relates to sustainability. Now, materials become unavailable if we cannot sustain our way of living. Now, the term sustainability today is widely used in the sense of how do I manage, how do I take responsibility for continuity. And interestingly enough, if you listen carefully, there is often a strange situation in which people say that they want to be sustainable. However, they don't want to say what is regarded as being worthwhile to be regarded as subject to sustainability. It's only dealing with certain aspects of the social, economic, and ecologic framework. Now, the paradox situation comes into place when you ask yourself for continuity, and at the same moment, you recognize that we do live in a changing society, that we do live in changing nature, and that we do live in changing economic conditions. So all of the latter three undergo permanent transformations, and yet sustainability starts with the idea to manage for continuity. And that's a strange situation because someone has to decide on what has to be handled in a sustainable manner and what not. Who is responsible for that decision? And logically, if you prioritize something else has not been prioritized. I would urge you to look at YouTube videos, to pick an example, in which they regain gold out of the metal contacts in electric circuits. Now, you could start from the point of view that, oh, we want to regain gold, therefore it's a sustainable process. You could also come from the point of view that there is a large amount of acids and potentially poisonous materials being used in that recycling process. So apparently I spoil part of materials in order to regain the other part of materials. So that's the paradox I'm after. Who decides on what is regarded as sustainable and what not? And that's a difficult situation because that goes along with price. Someone has to pay the price in terms of energy and in terms of material availability. I find that this aspect is not sufficiently discussed in most discussions around sustainability. Now, if we come from the point of view of value chains, I assume you are acquainted with the term value chains. It's a concept out of marketing. It was developed by Porter in the, I think, 60s or 70s. In essence, it's a concept in which the different steps a product or pre-products or byproducts go through prior to being produced, released to customers, and then destroyed or, if possible, be recycled. So highly abstract in the upper line, there is a material supply, there is energy supply, there is manufacturing, there is use, there is waste. Now, these linear value chains, you will intuitively assume that the responsibility of individuals or companies that work in this context end at the moment in which they sell products, be that the raw material, be that intermediate products, or be that final products. Now, that is a tricky situation because logically, if I would produce poison, logically, I would have to identify means to prevent the poison to reach the environment, even at the moment a customer has already access to this. So in this sense, my responsibility would extend the time in which I own legally the product that I'm producing. So what I'm trying to remind you of in this sense is ownership and responsibility are not the same. Pick another example, not necessarily out of this window. If I would sell, for example, an animal, and the animal would be treated bad by the subsequent owner, I may reserve the right to take back the animal, although I don't legally own it anymore. So the concept is well established. However, with respect to materials, raw materials, and to energy, it has a number of consequences. For example, in all Western, or maybe I could even say around the world, but at least in all Western countries, the state has taken over the responsibility for collecting and getting rid of waste. Not necessarily for recycling, but for waste collection, the state is responsible. Now, in order to prevent materials to be thrown away, regulations do apply. A famous set of regulations are called the extended producer responsibilities, in which the manufacturer, marked here, still has to take responsibility for what happens if the product, after being used by the user, is going to be exposed to the environment. So that is being handled by extended producer responsibility. And then there are deposit systems. So what we in Germany know as Pfandflaschen zum Beispiel. So you have a bottle. The bottle is made of a certain standardized material in a certain shape. And as a consequence, you can recollect it and reuse it without destroying the material, to take the drawback of, despite getting the material, have to go through all the production steps again. Other regulations of the same kind include the European regulation on electronic equipment, or the yellow dot as we know it. Now that, strictly speaking, applies with all steps in the production chain. There is a, I should still talk about this slide. The extended responsibilities schemes, as I said, they are intended to come from a point of view in which the manufacturer takes over responsibility of the past, even past the owner of the subsequent steps in the value chain, so that he gets back the raw materials or the deposited goods in order to reuse that. In that sense, The producer is responsible to collect, process, recycle, and dispose the packaging and the product. Now, that is also what we see in Germany for a number of products. You will know that packaging materials have to be taken back by the retailer, who is then entitled to return the packaging materials to the producer. That also is used in the industrial context. So that is, if you looked at the term extended responsibility schemes, extended producer responsibility schemes, that's what is meant with that. So the idea, of course, the objective is to increase collection and recycling, take burden off the state in the context that would otherwise occur in the context of waste collection, and thereby has a transfer of financial responsibility going from the municipality back to the manufacturer. So there's also a financial deal involved, and that's rather smart seen from the state perspective. And as a consequence, it provides an incentive for the producer to take on the responsibility to develop innovations, which would then make the product nicer, accessible for recollecting and reuse. Now, if we go for circular value chains, the situation look a bit more complex. And I take out a picture out of a presentation which I once did for the World Economic Forum a while ago. Now we start with manufacturing. The product, it could be a machine, a car, and so forth, is transported to the customer. The customer uses it, and in order to extend lifetime, service means are applied. The product is being collected either in parts or as a whole. It's sorted, it's tested, it's stored, and then remanufactured. And of course, if technical goods need to be refurbished, those are done in a different cycle. And as you will never get 100% of all materials back, you will have to supply material and energy in order to manufacture a new product. So the circle can start again. Now, in this level of abstraction, that looks rather nice. But if we pick an example, we talk about a printing press. The printing press is used here, and all of a sudden you see that at the moment of use, there is another value cycle involved, which is the value cycle of another economic cycle involved, which is the one of paper. And the paper, because you have to print so that the paper can get recycled, that the paper can get used again. So, and of course, there's then the ink also involved. The ink, of course, is used in the context of the press in order to create the image. There are other materials involved. So in reality, a construction like this is rather complex. And it especially gets complex if I want to optimize, as generally speaking, the collecting company does not talk to the storage company or the manufacturing company. The service person does not talk to the transport. And as I indicated, if value chains get even more complex, people don't talk to each other anymore. It's one of these miracles that if we talk about recycling today, implicitly we assume an existing legal and communication chain between all participants in a circular economy. And that does not exist. As a consequence, the legal requirements permanently increase, forcing individuals to talk, but on the other hand, limit the natural growth of economies. We will come back to that thought in a minute. What is also interesting is this logic that I applied earlier, and I pick a linear value chain here, but you could also pick a cyclic value chain. The external materials supply is not subject to extended producer responsibility. In Germany, that's handled by the Bergbaugesetz, and there is a material safeguarding clause, and it reads that the regulations that conflict with explorations and extraction of raw materials shall be applied so that there is a minimum limitations to materials access and harvesting. That's a difficult situation because if I would, to pick an earlier example, if I would be to mine and to harvest uranium, you would, as an intuitive observer, assume that I, as even the mining company, would have to take an extended responsibility for what is being done with the raw material, just as the subsequent step, that company that produces the ore, the metal out of the ore. Here, there's a weakness in the German legal construction, and that legal construction, I would hope, will be resolved rather sooner than later. If we spoke about declining availability of resources, we can talk about which materials are becoming rare. Now, there is what is called the European Critical Raw Materials Review, and those materials are listed, and currently the list is, I think, about 40 entries large. And if you look through it, there are materials in it like lithium, which you permanently find in car batteries, phosphate, which is one of the key enabler in fertilizers, phosphorus too. Also very often existing materials such as bauxite or silicon. So it's a particularly difficult list if you looked at it, and you find almost all enablers for modern technology. So if these materials are not accessible, that will cause problem both to industrial life and to to farming. To quote a person of the World Health Organization, or of the World Food Organization, the World Health, WHO, they said that, quote unquote, 60 years and then it's all over. A woman from the World Health Organization, a scientist there, said that the leaching of grounds will be so intense in future by industrialized farming production that within 60 years from now, at the moment, we will have no more fertilizers. There cannot logically be any more industrialized farming, and therefore we will face hunger. Another aspect to reduced availability of resources, if we looked at prices for resources, for materials, raw material, there is a worldwide commodity price index by McKinsey, and they calculated that as an average from the year 1900 to the year about 2000, 2005, prices were on a random sense, but they were still declining for raw material in average. However, after the year 2005, they increase again. That is an indicator that we see that prices for raw materials are in line with raw material scarcity. So we have to look also into the financial aspect of things. That again has been looked at also by prominent figures in public life. So Antonio Guterres last year said that we are destroying nature and regard it as wealth, saying that if we take out permanently material out of nature, regard the gross national product, which refers to the products that have been produced in a certain economy, if that permanently increase, our wealth increase, because the gross national product is a measure of wealth. On the same moment, that very effect causes the destruction of nature, which implicitly is regarded as wealth. So if you stand with your car in a traffic jam and you consume gasoline, you contribute positive to the gross natural product, which apparently is a stupid idea. So I strongly suggest, we don't have time to discuss that, but we may do in the discussion, but I strongly suggest to discuss economic concepts beyond gross national products. The Stiglitz Commission in France concluded at some point that that concepts which measure wealth differently, for example, the closest distance to an economically safe and sustainable area, no natural disasters around your hometown, that all of these things also may be regarded as wealth, and that again would take the economy away from measuring and being forced to use gross national product as a measure for wealth. Now, you could come to the idea that if you want to reduce consumption, you could extend the residence time by recycling, and thereby you would extend the period of responsibility, and thereby again, you would simply solve a complex problem. Now, there has been a publication a couple of years ago by a French guy named François Gross, who calculated that if I would have a recycling rate of 80% and an economic growth of 1% for the average of all material consumption, we would only manage to move material scarcity by some 60 years. So apparently, recycling does not solve the problem. And another one would be innovations. Now, if you would look at innovation, there has been a nice publication by Derek Sola Price. Now, Sola concluded that if you have a complex technical problem, most often the solution to that problem is even more complex. And for that, he did calculation, and he was able to prove that complex technical solutions require more energy and more resources than the problem they want to solve. And in total, the energy and material requirements increase and don't decrease with innovation. As a consequence, the only thing that you could use is you have a different and less consuming design of products. And that is what was called eco-design as a consequence. So eco-design, you see the two concepts on the left and on the right side here. The left side would be a complex product, the right would be a simple product, and the right one would serve the same purpose than the left one. However, you could easily detach it from where it was originally applied. You can throw it away without wasting additional resources, and it could produce it simpler. However, it requires more brain to be produced. The final aspect I would like to deals with time. And I will deal with a rather complex set of figures, and I hope you bear with me. Now, these figures on the right-hand side are taken out of the report of the Club of Rome of 1973. The dotted lines represent what was predicted, and the solid lines represent what was actually found in 2014. Now, you can see that you have to assume that what was done in the Club of Rome report was a computer simulation. And the computer simulation has natural errors in it. So if an error applies for about 10%, that shouldn't be a significant problem for the validity of the model. However, significant parameters in here go through a maximum and suddenly decline, which is food per capita, pollution, but also other parameters. And there's no indication that this is wrong. Now, after that maximum, pollution goes down again. Food per capita, however, also goes down, meaning from here on we have famine. We don't have sufficient food, and we don't have the resources anymore. When you looked at the report, and I also asked one of the authors of it personally on that matter in discussion, did they actually calculate that aspect back here? And then they said, no, they didn't calculate. They just let the simulation run further. And I argue that this is an organized deduction of values, but we will rather face wars in order to access food. As a consequence, like we see in the Ukraine, lots of people suffer because of a small war, comparably to the worldwide status. Now, what I said earlier were two things. I apply an optimal 80% recycling, so that could extend the availability. And I apply the effect of soil leaching. So I put an end to this, and that's what I said earlier. So that would take us to a significant problem with respect to raw materials and food in about less than 60 years from now. So the quote of this woman from the World Health Organization has been done in 2015, if I recall right. Now, if I look in terms of time of and responsibility, also from a point of view that Frank Karlowitz must have had, he must have had the point of view of a forester. Now, a forester wants to grow trees so that most likely his kids or himself in a later age can benefit from harvesting. Now, this is still in German, so this is a set of trees. This is the fraction that is that this tree has in the German forest, and this is the age in which the tree is usually harvested. And what you see here are ranges between 60 and 160 years or 140 years. Now that is lower than the natural lifetime. Now from Karlowitz, as a consequence, must have had a thought in mind in which responsibility would translate to a period of responsibility for about 100 to plus minus 40 years or so. Now, if you looked at products with the same perspective, a product needs to be designed, a product needs to be produced, a product usually stays for a certain time in the portfolio, a product is being used, then only the residence time of a cell phone would be around 4 years, of a car around 8 years, for a flatbed screen around 5.6 years, refrigerator around 30 years, laptops 5 years something, or a printing press around 15 to 30 years. Now, on top of that, we would have the design time, we would have the time to recycle things, we would have the time in the portfolio. So naturally, we should talk about times of plus minus 20 or 20 plus minus 15 years in order to accommodate for all these phenomena. Now, if you have poisons included, then these lifetimes would even extend further. It could be decades to a century. Now, a very holistic approach that we see in cultural scientists or in ethnology are two concepts for responsibility as they come from two people. One, the Iroquois people in the north of the US, Canadian-American border, and the other one would be the Maori people in New Zealand. If they would be asked for responsibility, the seventh generation, the Iroquois would regard that as a seventh generation principle, which says an actor must be able to take responsibility for everything that he does for the following 7 generations. Now, if a generation is assumed to be between 16 and 25 years, we end up with about the same than what von Karlowitz had earlier, around 130 plus minus 30 years. The Maori people came up with a lower period of responsibility, which would be around 80 years, as they regarded only 4 generations and all descendants as the time frame for which they take to responsibility. And if we include this, then all of a sudden, we see that the time frames nicely match this declining function here. So we have the products, as we have in the industrial environments, and we have what the Maori regard as responsibility, and we think of starting today. So the idea would be our responsibility ends in about, well, 80 to 130 years, and that would also be the lifetime of currently produced products. Now, there has been publications, and I would highly recommend to read publications by Tainter and Klein. And Tainter and Klein came up, especially Tainter, Joseph Tainter, came up with a concept to describe the dynamics of collapsing cultures. And Tainter referred to several cases in which the time or the dynamics went rather fast and steep. And the practical example calculated based on models like this by a guy named Klein, you can find that in literature. This period is regarded to be between 50 and 150 years from a high point in that culture to the culture losing practically all established structures in the sense of prosperity, education, health, civil safety, infrastructure, access to foods, schools, raw materials, and so forth. Now, another piece of information I would like to share, which is a bit more complex, for those of you who have fable in astrophysics, there is something called a Drake equation. And the Drake equation was created by Francis Drake, who calculated the probability of finding another civilized culture on our level in some kind of star around us. So if he calculated that, one of the functions in his equation is the lifetime of the culture in which this culture is accessing or can access and send signal. So the consequence is there is an equation like this. And a guy named Schellenhuber, Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber, the former director of the Potsdam Institute for Klimaforschung, once reshaped those formula and calculated with all what is known today the lifetime of civilized cultures as far as we can calculate it, based on the fact that we haven't found any in the last 60 years. And he ended up with a calculation that our cultures have a very high probability to not live longer than a total of about 200 years, starting around the year 2060. In other words, 1960. So that would lead to an end of our culture, statistically speaking, in around the year 2160. Now, we again see that this corresponds well to the numbers I quoted earlier. And that again supports scientists that say that we live at the very end of a stable time and enter a time in which our culture has a high probability of being disruptively changed. Now, for myself, that is a very difficult situation because as a teacher, university teacher, I would like to teach my students to know more about what they could use past the time of this transfer of stability. So we are today in a rather stable situation, and afterwards, after such a decline, we'll be in a stable situation. Now, it will not be the first time that cultures disappear. The Roman cultures did, the old Greek culture, the Egyptian culture declined. Now, what we have to do is we have to define education so that there are means to transmit and pass on knowledge so that the knowledge survives this time. And that for myself is something I would like to end my considerations with. I would regard as a responsibility of educational institutions to develop means and content which will be useful to the students of our today's students, because those are highly likely to be the ones suffering the consequences of what is done today. If I would summarize that, what I was trying to say is responsibility is incumbent to all individuals. It's also for companies and a main target of government activities. The time within which responsibility may take effect are reasonable to be assumed in the area of 1 century, which again is very much comparable with the type of figures that already have been published in the 70s. Shrinking energy supply and raw materials are known phenomena. As a consequence, if they are known, legally, they are in the area of our responsibility. And the only thing we can offer is reduction of consumption. Otherwise, legally, we are responsible. So I find, at least that's my opinion, responsibility for future is, in this sense, is not really subject or hardly translated into educational measures.